Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. A few months ago, I decided to do something that I had been holding off on doing for about a decade. And that is when I left the religion of my youth. I knew that there were support groups out there and Facebook groups and people that I could connect with that had also left. And since I left and had left while being shunned, I was particularly hurt. It was a very painful time period to not only sort of lose the infrastructure of my mind while simultaneously losing my family and friends support structure. So it was a really rough time period. And I strongly considered joining a support group or something to that effect. But every time I ventured out into that, unfortunately, it seemed that most of the people who were trying to be supportive of each other were just too angry. They had gone down this path of being angry for all the trauma that they had experienced, which I understood, but I wasn't angry. That's not the emotion I felt, and I didn't want to be in that energy. I wanted to be in an energy where I was healing from whatever I perceived were traumas, but I was also very insistent on integrating the positives. I didn't want to lose the positives of what I had been given my entire life. So anger didn't seem like the right emotion for me, so I just didn't join any of those groups. About a decade later, I saw a recommended Facebook group pop up that was called basically the title of it was like empowered people who had come from this religion. And I thought, okay, well, I'm gonna check that out. I've never joined a Facebook group around this subject, but I was gonna check it out and see if there was anything there for me. And it had been, a decade since I'd gone, so I figured I was probably okay. So I joined the group, and the person who runs it is great. He's really a motivational speaker, and he's somebody who does a lot of coaching with individuals. And this is not his primary thing. This is just one thing that he does. So as opposed to this being his primary gig and something he's dedicated his life to, he's actually dedicated to his life to other things, but he felt like he could show up in this space and offer some help. So I enjoyed him, the person who was running it, and the admin and the mods, and I felt like it was a pretty decent space. But I noticed that almost every time he invited new people in, he had to go through the same basically it's like the same script over and over. New people get let in, they write all these really like toxically snarky posts about the religion, just terrible things. He's got to come in and say, hey, there's lots of Facebook groups that are for that purpose. This is not one of them. We're here to move past it and help empower each other, not just talk crap about the old religion. Then all those people defend their snarkiness by saying, well, you shouldn't be telling me I can't say all this stuff because now you're sounding like the religion. And then he's got to come in and sort of explain the purpose again, and then they either self-select out or the group hemorrhages them or whatever. And then it's okay for a time, and then he invites new people in. And it's like a wash, rinse, repeat situation so often. And every once in a while, somebody will say, hey, I'm going to blow all your minds. I'm going to make this gratitude post about the religion of our past. And I don't think that they realize that that's actually the purpose of the group as well. And gratitude posts are the norm for that particular group, or at least they're supposed to be. And so then they'll congratulate themselves on having a positive post, which I can understand because it's in such contrast with all the stuff that people are normally saying when they leave. So the point of all of this is it really got me thinking about how easy it is to be angry and upset and bitter and resentful when we graduate beyond a really strong paradigm like religion. And so in order to not let myself get to that place where I just felt, now of course, if I needed to feel angry, and there have been times when I've needed to feel angry, like anger was the authentic response. And I'm not saying that if anger is the authentic response, you should be stamping it down into a bitter little ball and not acknowledging it and taking it out on somebody later. I'm saying that if you aren't already feeling anger, there's no reason to be surrounded by people who are and insinuate that that's the feeling you should be feeling. If you are feeling anger, wash it through, right? Like feel the emotion and then release it. But that said, you can get into these cabals, no matter what religion you came from or paradigm, you can get into these cabals of being now anti, or because you're rejecting it, and so you have to take the position on the other side of the line. And since this is so common, I sat down one day and I thought, okay, I wanted to integrate the lessons of my youth. I wanted to integrate all of the positive things that had come from it. I didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So what is a list, a non-comprehensive list, just a short list of the things that I'm particularly grateful for being raised in the religion I was in. And I was surprised at how much poured out of me. I just kept writing and writing and writing. Like, there was so much good to be had there that I thought, this is a time period right now where a lot of people are reevaluating their relationships with the paradigms of their youth. They're reevaluating their religions and their relationships with them. They're reevaluating maybe whatever was that old phrase I constantly quote from Robert Anton Wilson, who says the easiest way to be brainwashed is to be born. So we're all brainwashed into whatever paradigm our parents give us. That's how it has to happen. Otherwise, we'd be feral. But then we get to a certain age and we start reevaluating that. And when we sort of separate from that quote unquote brainwashing, and I say that in the best possible way, when we separate from that and start to, figure out what we believe and who we are and find our own identity as well as our own paradigms that we've constructed, I think one of the healthiest things we can do is take those lessons, take the positive lessons from what we were given. And so I thought that maybe we could do an entire podcast on gratitude for, and I'll say this as a meta frame, gratitude for the paradigm of your past, whatever that is. It could be agnostic, atheist. It could be a political paradigm. It could be just a worldview that your parents had. It doesn't have to be religious. But I think that we're going to talk about it in the context of religion because that's what we came from. So we're going to talk about gratitude around our religious upbringing and the positives it brings. And if this is not your experience, then I recommend seeing it in two ways. Number one, you can see it in the way of if you're not religious and have never been religious and you think religion is all bad and evil, this might be something that is a counterbalance to religion is wholly evil thought, because I personally believe that is an inaccurate statement. And the second thing is, if you've not been religious and you've not gone through this process, then just maybe use it as a model for how one can show gratitude for the paradigm of their past if they are reconstructing their own sort of mental map or worldview.
As you were talking, I've been jotting a bunch of notes down, stuff that came to me. And the first question I have here quickly for you before we keep going is, you didn't feel anger, and most people you said did. What emotion did you feel? That's curious. My introverted feeling wants to know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I am an Enneagram 3. So I'm in the grief triad or the heart triad of the Enneagram. And so I experienced a lot of grief and sadness. Sadness was my number one feeling.
Because I experienced anger. Anger was my go-to. I understand that very clearly.
Well, and also, I mean, if you've heard us talk about the Enneagram, if you're familiar with the Enneagram model, 3s descend to 9, and 9 is repressed anger. So I may have been feeling angry, but I wasn't really letting myself see it. And like I said, there were moments when I allowed anger to come up, but for the most part, I just felt incredibly sad. Just very, lots and lots and lots of grieving.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was just curious what you had felt, because I know that anger is something so underpinning for so many people. So we've talked a little bit about this on the podcast in some ways, where we've talked about the skills that we've learned from our religious upbringings, our paradigms, the time period we were raised in, the way our parents raised us in these religious, contexts. And we've articulated some of the benefits of that. So, public speaking. I was in, my parents had a ministry, and so there was a radio station I was able to be a part of at a very young age. Like, I was running my dad's radio boards at 13 years old. So one of the reasons we have a podcast and I know what to do with this and how to create podcasts is because of that experience. There's a lot of things that have benefited us, right? Running live events, we know how to do that because of our background. So there have been a lot of skills, but I think what you're talking about is not just being grateful for some of the skills that came out of it, but being directly grateful for some of the principles that seemingly got rejected. The baby with the bathwater thinking, well, I'm leaving this paradigm behind me. I'm throwing all of this out for a time because I want to rewire myself. I want to change how I see the world. and you go, wait a minute, one might say, wait a minute, after you do a little growth and development, you reconnect the gratitude. You say, there were some principles I learned in my religious paradigm that are universal truths and universal principles that I'm really grateful for, even though I had to kind of distance myself from them for a time just to get a sense of like what are mine and what are this paradigms. So I think that's where we're really going to focus on today. We're going to probably talk about some of the skills. I just briefly mentioned it, but I think that's really where my focus is in expressing gratitude for my background. And I encourage you listening too to be thinking in those terms, the skills and maybe the understanding on like a legitimate or a logistical or pragmatic level, but also what are the underpinnings of how you see the world and the way you're wired and the principles that were instilled upon you. And those aren't necessarily, like those are still useful. Those are still beneficial to us often from those paradigms. And I think that's what we want to focus in on today.
Yeah, like the character of who I am based on how my parents, not my parents, but just like the religion itself encouraged me, like the kind of person it encouraged me to be. Now, it's some of those things I have fully rejected. And I do acknowledge in some of those ways there was there were things that I was encouraged to do and be that were not authentic for me and were quite unhealthy. And now that I'm older, I have to contend with that. And I have to figure out who I am separate of whatever, inculcation I got from my past. And there's some things that I am very grateful, some lessons and characteristics that I'm extremely grateful that I don't know who I would be without them. And I think the first one that always comes to my mind is humility and modesty, because those were things that were really drilled into me as a kid. And I think I've even talked about it in the past. Like I did this big sort of biblical study on the differences between humility and modesty. Now, of course, I was using source material from the religion I came from. So depending upon whatever religion you were raised in or currently in, your results might vary. But one of the big things that I learned as a difference between humility and modesty is that humility is being willing to not put yourself first, to see yourself as not necessarily better than others. It's a willingness to set yourself aside in behalf of other people. And I think that I almost suspect in the modern world that that's considered to be a bad quality or characteristic. Almost like if you have humility, you're letting yourself be walked on. But I personally don't feel like humility treats people to not have boundaries. In fact, I think that truly humble people are pretty good at setting boundaries because they're not as reactionary. They're not always questioning whether or not somebody's taking advantage of them. And coming from a place of humility is part of what allows you to get outside of the situation. So you're not always reacting. You're not always like wondering if somebody's just stepped on your toes. You're going to get triggered a lot less. Humble people get triggered less because they don't see everything as an attack. And I'm very grateful that humility has taught me to be able to hold space for a situation and determine whether or not this is a situation where I need to, quote unquote, take one on the chin, which actually very rarely it is. Most of the time when people are triggering each other and at each other's throats, it's because their egos are so defensive. Their egos are actually at each other's throats. But egos are rarely aggressive without first being defensive. Like to the ego, a good defense is a good offense. And so humility allows me to, I think it was like the beginning of my ego work, which is why I suspect that religion is actually our earliest attempts at doing ego transcendence work.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. like that's just sort of my assumption. And the humility piece is the ability to calm your ego down for a moment and tell it that even if it has to take a hit, it's going to, in the long run, be fine. And so when you do back off the pedal and not make assumptions that people are coming at you and be willing to take the hit and then discover later that you didn't have to take the hit at all. In fact, very rarely are you taking hits. You're more observing other people dancing in their ego. When you develop humility and the willingness to not have to assert yourself, it calms everything down and allows the other person's ego to do some spinning for a while until they realize you're not dancing with them. Two egos dancing together can get itself into such a such a cluster, it can turn into nuclear war if the egos are not careful. But if one person's dancing and the other person isn't, if the humble person is allowed the other one to do whatever dance that other person needs to do, oftentimes they will calm down. And the humble person, just by allowing themselves to be in that context or situation, will effectively destroy the need for ego protection to begin with. Such a valuable character trait, such a valuable characteristic. And almost every time I see myself getting all spun up, it's because I'm lacking humility. It's because I'm lacking that moment of, I think that my ego should be the important one here. I think my ego is the one that needs to be taken into consideration. When really, I do believe that my ego needs to be taken into consideration also, but it doesn't have to be taken into consideration first. And it doesn't have to insist on it. It should probably be represented if I'm in any situation that I want to be sustainable for me. My ego needs to be represented in those situations. But if it's patient and if it just allows the other person to represent themselves, then we'll get to me. We'll get there eventually. And the more I hold space for other people and allow them to be represented first, I find that they listen to me so much more. My ego gets represented better because I was willing to listen to them. And now they are usually creating reciprocity there. They're usually a lot easier. It's a lot easier for them to listen to me. And I think that these principles show up in a lot of personal development things too, like the whole concept of nonviolent communication. Nonviolent communication is a lesson in conversational humility. It really is. Stephen Covey's concepts, a lot of his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that concept of seek to understand before being understood, that is a lesson in humility. Most ego transcendence work is a lesson in humility. And so humility can come from any quarter, really. I'm grateful that I was taught it in my religious past so that when I became somebody who really got into personal growth and personal development, I didn't have to learn that one from scratch.
I think humility gives us perspective. I think you're absolutely right. And it's this idea. I mean, I go through my world, if I'm honest with myself, and you do too, Antonia, and you listening to this. I mean, as much as all of us would probably want to pretend like we don't, we all go through the world imagining or thinking that we're the most important thing on the planet. Our death would be the biggest tragedy the world's ever seen. Like, we're wired for that, for survival. Like, I actually believe that. And I know that if I walk down the streets of Manhattan in New York City, everybody's believing this about themselves. Like, everybody believes their life and their existence is so important because it is the existence that they're living. They're in their personal experience. We all are. And I think humility reminds us that, oh yeah, like I believe this about my life and world, and the person across from me here also believes this too. And if I come and go at them, we cause conflict or come and push each other, our egos push each other, that's not going to really serve anybody. I have to realize through the humility structure you're talking about that this other person feels very similar about their life that I do, and I have to understand and hold space for that on that side. And I do believe that's very much, now in a religious context or maybe paradigm context, it's outsourced. We like put it to God, like we have to kind of externalize this in some way. But the principle is still the same. Like, the ego, I'm not that important because God's more important than me. That's how we kind of rationalize it in a religious context, for example. But the principle is I'm not that important. Maybe other people or there's other things that are important in the world. I am important. I shouldn't just lay myself down, but I also shouldn't and this is where that modesty concept, Antonia, comes into. I also shouldn't overinflate myself either. Like, a really good, modest assessment of who I am and where I am in the world on like a fundamental level is helpful for all of us. And I think that's something else religious or often some of these paradigms can teach us. At least I think what we could say is, as you're listening, whatever paradigm you come from, think about what your gratitude lies in there. And we'll talk about what our gratitude lies in for us in the specific paradigms we came from. And so from a religious context, I think religion gave us both that humility and modesty piece.
Yeah, I find humility to also be quite liberating. That idea that we all go through the world believing that our death would be the greatest tragedy the world has ever seen. I think we think it's the greatest tragedy the universe will have ever experienced.
Sure.
And that's our ego, like you said, that's our ego protecting itself. It needs to believe that it's important in order to prioritize its continued life. And so when it prioritizes its continued life, then now it's going to make sure it survives to the next, to the next generation and so on. So we're programmed to be the opposite of humble. You're dead on right. And the most liberating thought I've ever had was when I realized that when I die, it's not going to matter at all. Like the universe isn't even going to blink. There are people in my ecosystem that might grieve my death. If I have given back to the world and I've given value to the world, there will be an ecosystem people who will grieve my death, and I'm glad about that. I'm glad that my death will be grieved. I'll want to have meant something for a time, and also once those people, it's like that concept of two deaths we've mentioned on the podcast before. You die twice. The first time you die is a physical death, and the second time you die is the last time anybody's ever said your name. So there's going to be a shelf life to the people who even remembered that I existed.
Like Einstein has died physically, but he still lives, and that we talk about him. We still reference his name. Yeah. But someday his name won't be referenced, thousands and thousands and thousands of years from now, potentially.
Yeah, there's
and that'll
like
be his second death.
Yeah, there's like a cluster, a handful of people whose names we still talk about, but they're so far away from the actual etymology point that who knows if we're talking about those people as they actually were when they existed. We have no idea. We remember their names, but we don't remember them. Not really. We have stories, but who knows if our stories are even accurate.
Like Cleopatra.
Yeah,
who
exactly.
knows? Like, how do we know?
Yeah, exactly. So there's not really much ripple that are like when we die. It's not a tragedy at all. And for some people, that feels like, well, then you can do anything you want to. But it did the opposite for me. Once I realized that my death wasn't going to matter, I decided I wanted to make my life matter. And so as long as I'm here, I want to be a force for good if possible. Even though I know that I'm arbitrarily defining good, I still want to be somebody who is who does everything I can to promote life positive things, right? Things that make us better, make us happier. And so that's what I do. And it was incredibly liberating to go, I'm not going to worry about my death. I don't need my ego to flare up all the time. I don't need to see everything as a threat. If I get hit by a bus tomorrow, that's going to be perfectly fine. And I had a great run and I'm very grateful for it. And also, I don't have to care about my ego that much. It's going to take, it looks after me. It's going to take care of me. And if for some reason at some point it stops, that's just how it was. Incredibly liberating thought. It's almost like I'm not untriggerable. I've heard people talk about becoming untriggerable, which is a really nice concept. And in ego transcendence, it's a nice idea to become untriggerable. I'm not there yet by any stretch, but it is very difficult to trigger me. And that's very liberating. Like, I'm very happy about that. And I feel like that was a lesson that that's a gift humility gives to me. That doesn't mean I don't care about things. And I almost wonder sometimes if people conflate getting triggered with caring about something. Like, I think we've conflated those two. But getting triggered doesn't mean you care about the thing they're talking about. It means you care about your ego's response to the thing they're talking about. That's actually what's happening. Your ego feels threatened. So getting triggered actually it's not a statement at all about how you feel about the subject. It's a statement about how threatened your ego is by the conversation. And when your ego calms down and you're humble, you stop getting triggered by your ego stops getting triggered by the threat that the conversation represents to it. And at that point, you can actually talk about the subject itself. You actually are in a position to do more good if you're not triggered.
That's a really great point. And I can identify with that in my life. When I feel triggered about something, it's like a survival mechanism for me to go, oh no, I got to stand up for my rights here. I got to make sure I put my flag in the ground. I got to make sure that nothing's going to threaten my it's almost like a survival threat. Like at a core lizard brain primal level, I feel like I'm going to die. Like when I notice that triggers happen, I think that's what happens with those.
And I think religion is one of the best places to learn this lesson. I think religion is, I also believe that meditation and ego transcendence work is great. But how many people do you know in your life that do ego transcendence work? Like none of them. Nobody knows what that means. And most people go to church, or at least maybe a smaller percentage now than in the past, but enough people go to church. And if they listen, they'll hear this message. And so it's a meme that it gets disseminated into the, to the religion sphere. And I would say that this pops up in basically every religion, like not just Christianity. It pops up in all of the religions. And the distinction I made between humility and modesty, the reason why I even started going down that road is because I read a scripture that said that God humbled himself. It was like somewhere in the Hebrew scriptures being somewhere between Genesis and Malachi. And I can't really remember which scripture it was now because it's been like probably 20 years ago. But I remember thinking, well, God can't be humble, right? Like, how is God humble? And then I realized that at no point in the Bible does it say that God is modest. So God was humble but not modest. So what's the difference between those two things? I had always heard about modesty being around how you dress. And so I wanted to go further down the rabbit hole of what modesty actually was. And the more I peeled back the onion layers of the word modesty, fundamentally it meant understanding your limitations, knowing when you are reaching a limitation somewhere. And what's nice about modesty is that modesty means that you get an accurate perspective, like you're calibrated to where you have a limitation. And that means that you own the good stuff. If you don't have a limitation, or if you're not particularly limited in a way, then you get to own that. Being modest, like false modesty, is pretending that you're better at something than you are, or that you're worse at something that you're good at. So you don't want false modesty. You want accurate, calibrated modesty, which is acknowledging when you have a limitation. Now, of course, God would never be modest according to the scriptures because he doesn't have any limitations. So modesty wouldn't apply to him. So he humbled himself but was not modest. So modesty is also a gift that I take, this concept of modesty, because it has allowed me, or it's given me permission to own things that I feel like I'm good at, own things that maybe I even have evidence that I'm good at. And I don't have to be falsely modest, just I don't have to be falsely humble. False humility is acting out of pride, but smuggling it under a veneer of humility. Being falsely modest is indicating that you're bad at something when you're actually good at something, and oftentimes this is a form of pride as well. So avoiding all styles of pride while at the same time allowing myself to feel good about what I am truly good at and allowing myself to have a healthy self-esteem, that's a gift that I got from my religious background.
And it serves, I'm trying to identify what it serves here. Like mechanistically, if we're modest and humble, my instinct, it serves connection with others. Like it serves a connection with other people. Would you agree with that? Is that kind of how your instincts are around these two things that we learn from our religions?
I would say that it helps serve both connection with others and connection with myself.
But it's a connection service. It serves connection in some way.
Yeah.
Okay. I can see that because I think about some of the things, like some of the lessons that come to my mind, and I think those are important, but my focus isn't as much on connection. My focus is on maybe other things. Like, one of the things I learned is self-sacrifice, like, which is one of the biggest lessons I learned in my religious paradigm. Now, it was for God, and with God removed as kind of the reason for self-sacrifice and the reward/punishment system that represented, I had to do a lot of questioning, like, well, what's the benefit in me self-sacrificing now? Like, I don't get to go to heaven necessarily, and I don't avoid hell, but self-sacrifice on behalf of others, like, it was definitely tied to a reward system. So at the time I was like, that's really bad. I was thinking in terms of like, I'm doing this for a reason, like an outcome. Like I wanted to self-sacrifice. I wanted to go to heaven, not hell. And I was avoiding, punishment and going toward reward. And so I've had to really figure out how to connect, because this is the core for me when I ask about these questions, these principles, is without the framework of like a Godhead, how do I connect this to my actual life? Like, why would I self-sacrifice now? What's the benefit if there's no reward or punishment I'm avoiding or going toward? And again, it comes back down to the connection piece as far as that goes. I think self-sacrifice also lends itself to connection with myself and others. Like it creates a connection channel between people. And that's probably why it evolved into religions, is because it was a way for society or civilized people to be able to have those social connections. And then it got pulled into like the whole God structure, reward, punishment system and the incentives of all that. But the purpose of it was to connect. Does that resonate with you? Is that kind of how that feels like to you? Because I'm trying to void of God, how does that work for us?
Yeah, to serve a greater good. Like, if you don't, I mean, once you codify, now, I suspect that religion is born of the Graves levels. Like in Graves 2, I mean, even in Graves 1, we probably had a bit of God of the Gaps.
Animistic stuff.
Exactly. In Graves 2 is where a lot of shamanistic, animistic, sort of spirituality lives. And then by the time you get to, 3, you start having animal heads on human bodies, which is more of like sort of an Egyptian way of looking at religion. And then by the time you get to Graves level 4, you have a lot more codified, sort of like the Code of Hammurabi type of stuff where it's a lot of laws that, like the Mosaic Law Covenant and that sort of thing. It's a lot of laws that are basically like try not to hurt and be mean to other people.
And you get the invisible sky gods there. You get kind of this, like the god's no longer a tangible animal-headed human you worship as an idol or something. It's like this, it's a concept now. He or she is a concept outside of you.
Yeah, it's an abstraction. And they're ways to dogmatize nice treatment to each other. But folded in all of that is also nice treatment to God, because it falls apart without nice treatment to God. If you don't have the number one rule be worship God as your only God, then all the other laws that ostensibly come from that God are going to lack the same level of credibility. So then idolatry becomes super important. Even though at this stage of the game, I don't really feel like idolatry is that big of a deal, because I feel like we idolize things all the time. It's part of our human nature. And yet one could argue religion itself is a form of idolatry if you don't believe that it's like true and real. It's just like another form of idolatry. But it kind of doesn't matter, because most of what is wrapped into these religious doctrines is an attempt to have people no longer put themselves in front of everybody else. And it does create connection, but I also think that we get rewarded for it as humans, because we are social creatures. From the time that our animal brains were the dominant portions of our brain, right? The mammalian, sort of, if you look at it through the ostensibly discredited triune brain theory, where you've got the lizard brain, and then the mammalian brain is built on the lizard brain, and then the neocortex or human brain is built on that. Even from the time that we were 100% working with mammalian brain, and neocortex was just a little glimmer in our, in the little twinkle in the eye of our genetic DNA. It was yet to be. Back then, we got rewarded for protecting others and for being in, human collectives, and for taking care of each other and grieving when one of us died, and sacrificing the self in order to help the others in these collectives, flourish. And so because of that, we have a lot of chemical rewards for being kind to each other, right? Not always immediately. It's a long game. That's one of the things, by the way, that religion also helped teach me, is the concept of the long game, but I'll mention that in a moment. And so there's a lot of positives to developing characteristics that isn't me first. And one of those is that we get rewarded by our own chemistry. Like we get rewarded by our own minds. Kind of like we get rewarded when we work out. Like after you work out, especially if you're not somebody who's used to it, you will be sore as hell the next day, and by the second day you'll want to kill yourself. And your body will reward you for having done it because it knows it's healthy. It's the same thing with humility. It's the same thing with modesty. It's the same thing with self-sacrifice. All of these things are brain rewards, maybe not in the moment. And in fact, it might be quite painful in the moment if you're not used to it. But our brains are set up to reward us for these kinds of behaviors unless we are dealing with sociopathy. So what's nice, though, is that religion codifies all of this. It wraps it into and teaches you to integrate it into your character. If you're really focused on religion and doing it with your whole heart. You can be a person who just goes to church on Sunday or goes to a mosque on Sunday or whatever. Like wherever you're going, you can do that every Sunday and then just kind of get like the little buzz of hearing a message and move on. But if you're a person who really tried to live the message, really tried to live what you were taught, then it gets seeped into you. And these characteristics kind of end up in the marrow of your bones. And so you don't have to learn them later. Like you don't have to learn them when you're going through a miserable experience with maybe like divorce for the first time or something terrible happens to your family, like a gross injustice or whatever. That's not your first life lesson in humility. Like you've already been prepared for this. You've been studying and you've been prepping for this moment. So when it hits, you have more resources to be able to handle it.
I think this all does tie into the long game concept you talked about. The long game being in, let's just use our backgrounds, or at least I'll use my background, I should say. This idea of heaven is the reward at the end of all of this for self-sacrifice, humility, modesty, all the things I should quote unquote be doing. That's the reward at the end of it. And it's putting yourself aside now for something better later. Don't eat the one marshmallow now, you can have the 2 marshmallows later kind of concept. And I think that's really, these 3 things we've already identified tie into the long game very much so. It ties into the connection like we talked about in the moment, like the connection between us. And I think that's why it probably started. And then also it's like, oh, you know what? I don't have to have it all right now. Like I can delay gratification, self-sacrifice, humility, modesty, working with others. Like let's collectively rise the tide for everybody. Kind of this collective get together and make this happen for all of us, because we're going to be stronger if we all rise together rather than one individual getting it all. So I think that's really what comes up for me. And I think the long game ties into this, that future, like this is forever. I got to think in terms of eternity, and how I act right now today in my moment in the next 5 minutes is going to impact my eternity. It really wires you to take account of the immediacy of things. You have a sense of, it deconnects the urgency of how important things are right now to my ego or right now for everything. It really ties you to, wow, that's in the future. That's something else. Now I think something else comes from that is that deferred life thinking. There's a challenge here in that, I'll keep delaying everything because my real life starts after I die in heaven, So there's a challenge there. Or after I do all this work now, someday I'll be able to cash the chips in. And I think that isn't necessarily healthy either. But I think this long game thinking can be really powerful for us in the moment when our egos flare up.
Yeah, we call it giving a gift to your future self. Like you and
Yep.
I. Yeah, so it's like, I don't want to do the dishes. We just had dinner and I just want to sit in the back porch on the deck and just, drink tea and enjoy the sunset and not have to think about dishes. And one of us will look at the other one and go, let's give a gift to our future self. Let's just hit the dishes now. And so what you're talking about, this idea of this can also bleed into that concept of the deferred life program, which we've done entire podcasts on in the past. There's actually, when you are able to do a long game thinking, one of the things you can do is discipline yourself to get things handled now to be able to, in the future, rest and have a moment. Like I'm so grateful the next morning when I do that, because then instead of having to do the dishes the next morning when things are caked on and it's hard to do, I get to just make coffee and go sit on the deck again and watch the sunrise, right? Like I get to enjoy the morning on the deck as opposed to have enjoyed the evening on the deck. Now, sometimes it's worth it to me to enjoy the evening on the deck. Maybe sometimes that's better. And so I take the hit the next morning. But most of the time, just handling things now is actually, it's long game thinking. Handle these things now so that you can not just, cash in your chips later, but actually give a gift to your future self.
It's the agrarian thinking too. You sow seeds, you nurture the soil, you water the garden, you harvest, and you benefit. It's like the cycle of life too that I think religious context taught us. That's one of the gratitudes I have, is that there's this concept in the Bible, you reap what you sow. It's a very farmer, agricultural term, but man, it sure bears out in life. Like the things that I experience now are the seeds I sowed 10, 20 years ago. The hard work I put in, or the lack of discipline I didn't have. Like whatever I'm doing now will come to bear out for me in the future. And what I'm experiencing now is something I sowed the seeds of in the past. And I think that concept also comes from this religious, and I'm very grateful for that thinking. I think that really helps me understand, how these energies play out over time. And the way I do things now has an impact for the future.
Yeah, and it also helps me remember that when I'm experiencing something, I probably was part of the reaping on that, right? The sowing. I'm reaping what I'm sowing to some extent. Not always. Sometimes
or you're reaping something somebody sowed.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So then I can look at it as a system and go, okay, is there anything that I could have done differently? What can I do now? And what can I do differently in the future? And so it almost, what's crazy about the religion I grew up in is that as seeped in the drama triangle as it was, and we've done podcasts on the drama triangle as well, as opposed to what we call the empowerment dynamic. As much as the religion I was raised in was seeped in the drama triangle, I believe that the messages that they were trying to convey, like the original messages, were messages that attempted to get people into the empowerment dynamic. Like they were in the drama triangle, but some of the words got through. And the words were like, hey, remember, you reap what you sow, right? That's a you're a creator, you're not just a victim.
One of the things that I've realized in watching myself and others outside of my religious paradigm, the way I've become grateful for some of the things I learned there was seeing their absence in the world when I'm away from it. And one of the things I've noticed in our modern world among a lot of people is a disconnect from some of the core things that we can offer each other that I learned in my religious background. So as an example, this concept of grace, this concept of extending grace to somebody even when they don't deserve it, even when they've behaved badly toward me, even when they've acted terrible in their own selfish interests. And the mechanism of grace in me, it's maybe a little different than forgiveness, but it's grace. It's almost extending a graciousness to someone when they don't deserve that graciousness. Like they don't deserve it. It's something that they didn't earn. In fact, they acted badly. They were, in my old religious day, I'd say they were sinful and wicked in God's eyes. And in the religious paradigm, God extends grace to those people. And by a follower of God, I was also encouraged and, pushed toward extending grace to people. And that wired in my mind to the point where it is hard for me to hold grudges long term. It's hard for me when someone behaves badly and acts up and does something that really offends me or offends culture or offends something. I have a tendency to go, man, I want to extend grace to that person. Like it's almost an automatic trigger that I have inside of me to extend that grace. And I think that's something that we do not have in our world at all. And again, I'm not just even talking about forgiveness as somebody that's wronged you directly, because a lot of grace is extended to people that didn't affect you directly. It's somebody that you just think is a bad actor in the world. And to extend grace to them, it's almost like if you extend grace to somebody, you're condoning or endorsing something they did or their behaviors. And I don't think that's what grace is about. I think grace is about saying this is a human being with their own motivations and all their own troubles and traumas and their own internal trying to figure it out. And I, as a human, can offer them grace and reduce the harshness I direct at that person, because that means something about me. It's not even about that person. It's about the mechanisms in me. It's keeping that open channel of grace and graciousness that's so powerful for me as a human. It makes me more joyful. It helps me go through the world being less triggered, being less upset. It helps me understand other people and offer them grace first, and then I get more facts, because often I'm wrong in my assessments anyway of what they quote unquote did or didn't do, right? The facts aren't all in yet. And I jump to something and I go, wait a minute, let me extend grace to this person first, or this collective or this culture or whatever, and try to understand it from a gracious place instead of just coming from a hostile place all the time.
Yeah, and grace gives birth to mercy, I think, too.
That's correct.
And mercy is, I think, a hard one to find in the world if a person hasn't gone through a religious upbringing. I think mercy is one of the most difficult ones. And I've noticed a lot of compartmentalized mercy in this world. Like there are people who are deserving of mercy and there are people who are not deserving of mercy. And so it's people
categorical.
People are merciful, but in a category or a compartment. And I think that's one of the most powerful lessons that religion can teach, is this idea of mercy extended to all. And it makes me think of, and of course, in the religious paradigm that I was raised in, it was this concept of the propitiatory sacrifice, right? Like Jesus' death covered all mankind's sin. And so nobody was left out of that, from somebody who swore once in their life all the way up to a serial killer.
There's a positional debt among humanity with God, and he covered that.
Right, exactly. And the word propitiatory is, it literally means a covering over. It was originally used as, there was a propitiatory cover on the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy of the temple. And the covering over the Ark of the Covenant, that propitiatory cover, was a symbol that was representing what Jesus or the Messiah was going to do later when he covered over the sins of all humanity. So this concept of propitiation, even though it's like a $5 word, and I no longer believe in a propitiatory sacrifice because I'm no longer, I'm no longer religious like I was in my youth. But that word comes up for me a lot, is propitiation. When somebody does something that makes me irate or furious, like I get righteously indignant, and I believe that they do not deserve mercy, the word propitiatory comes up in my mind. But I've taken this concept from a deified, prophetic, symbolic thing outside of myself that some other disembodied, deity did in behalf of humanity. And I integrate it inside of me, and I ask myself if I have enough cloth to propitiate this. I mean, I know that's a really weird metaphor, but I ask myself, do I have enough inside of me to extend mercy to this person? Can I do a covering over of their sins? And in the faith background of my youth, somebody had to die for that. One person literally died for everybody, right? A perfect being died for all sinful mankind. To balance the scales of the original perfect man who sinned and blah, 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 blah. But all of that said, I ask myself what part of me has to die in order to extend mercy to the other person? Do I have to die to do that? And on a physical level, the answer is no. On an emotional level, the answer could be yes. There could be an emotion of mine that I'm holding on to that I'll have to allow to just sort of let go. Like I might have to kill that emotional experience. Is the emotional experience healthy for me to begin with, right? Is there a reason I was holding on to that emotional experience? Is there a thought of mine or a series of thoughts or belief structures that has to die? Like what part of me has to die in order to extend mercy? And if the answer is parts of me that are intrinsic and important to me, I won't kill myself to extend mercy to a person. And quite honestly, now that I'm out of my my religion, I don't actually believe 100% of people deserve mercy. I mean, a merciful perspective, perhaps, but not necessarily I'll just say it. I don't actually think everybody should be alive. I don't. There are some people, and I'm not saying that we should kill them, just some people I know that, they cause more destruction than they'll ever give, right? Like there are people who all they do is want to kill people. That's all they want to do. They just want to destroy life. And the question of if that person was taken out, would that actually be merciful? In my opinion, the answer is sometimes yes. It would actually be a mercy to no longer allow them to live a life where they're so destructive and so distraught and so going counter of every other human being that they would just be removed.
So I have a bunch of type notes I've been writing down as we've been talking. I want to bring up at the end of this because I think it's very interesting from a typology standpoint and how we see things as different personality types. I want to posit some of these ideas to you, but I don't want to interrupt the gratitude piece. I want to kind of tie it up with maybe some conversation around type at the end. I think it's very interesting what you just said, and I want to come back to it in a little bit.
Yeah, I know that I'm talking about mercy, and then I just said not everybody should be alive. So I recognize the weirdness of that.
Yeah, and I think I've got some thoughts on this I'd like to share with, I'd like to co-create with you.
And it's probably a very NT perspective of mine. Probably. I bet every NT is nodding, and everybody else is horrified.
I'm not horrified.
But that said, not everybody deserves quote unquote mercy in the way that we oftentimes define it, and most people do. The overwhelming majority of people do. And so what I brought with me, what I integrated is this idea that most people do, and I might not be qualified to figure out who doesn't. When I say some people shouldn't be alive, that's not me saying I am qualified to determine who those people are or that any human being is, right? I'm not trying to say that's we should just be taking people out. Not saying that at all. I think on a theoretical level, maybe some people do more harm than good in the world, substantially, to a point where it would be okay if they didn't exist. And also, I don't think that I'm qualified to be the person who makes that determination. And so because of that, I just extend mercy in general. It's become that propitiatory concept has become integrated inside of me, and I do everything I can to extend the concept of propitiation, covering over, and mercy to everybody.
I think in that same vein of mercy and grace, I think forgiveness comes in here too. And that's another big lesson I learned in my religious paradigm is the idea of forgiveness towards somebody who has wronged you, and it's mostly for the person doing the forgiving, obviously. But it was very wired into me as a young man, from the time I was a little kid. When you say you're sorry for something, you ask the other person for forgiveness. You've created a debt structure there. And we've done a whole podcast on forgiveness, and you can hear some of my thoughts and some of Antonia's thoughts on that podcast, because we have some interesting takes on how forgiveness and debt structure and all this happens. But there's almost like a debt that's created, and then you ask for forgiveness, and then that debt is absolved. And that's a microcosm of what God's done for us. There's a debt incurred by being born into a system that you are definitively sinful in, just because you're born into it, not because of what you did. At least that's my background. And then there's nothing you can do to make that right. You have to basically surrender yourself and accept God's propitiatory sacrifice to cover your debt and forgive you of your debt. So it's a forgiveness structure, but it teaches, this idea of, there's this parable in the Bible called the unforgiving debtor, where it talks about this guy who owes this debt, and he pleads for mercy from the person he owes the debt to, the lender that he owes the debt to. And he says, please have mercy on me. And the lender's like, you know what? I'm going to have mercy on you. And when goes ahead and has mercy on this man, and then this man has a debt that's owed to him, and he turns around, and the person that owes him the debt, he says, you have to pay up. And the guy pleads for mercy. He says, well, can you give me mercy? He says, there's no mercy here. You need to pay up. And it's kind of two-faced. It's kind of like a double standard. Like he wants forgiveness from the person he owes a debt to, but he's not willing to forgive people he has debt, from. And then eventually the story talks about how the original debtor changes his mind now. Well, if you're not going to forgive others, like I forgave you, then all bets are off. Like that's not cool, man. Like, what are you doing? Like, I forgave you, and you're not even going to give the same kindness to other people. And that's really stuck in my head. Like, I always think in terms of that. Like, if I'm going to be a certain way in the world, I expect other people to be kind of that way. And I just, it's baffling to me when people don't extend forgiveness to others, when I am very quick to want to forgive people that maybe have wronged me. Sometimes it's really hard. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's like there's not wounding there. I mean, I've had some people do some really terrible things to me and still doing terrible things to me, and then I can't get out of the situation. Like, I can't change the situation because they're involved in my life in a way I just can't alter it without making a lot of damage, but yet they're still in my life. And I have to find ways to forgive them and have mercy and grace in those moments for somebody that's mistreating me directly. And that is very difficult. But you know what? It changes something in me if I'm able to do it. It really doesn't even matter the person. There's just this energy over here doing this thing. It's about my response to it that's so important for me. And that's something I'm really grateful for. I got that in religion. I see some people that didn't come through the religious structure I did. They don't have that in their psychology. They don't have that in the wiring of their mind as much. And there's some of it, because I think we kind of get this in at least here in the West, in the United States and maybe some other westernized countries, there's like a Judeo-Christian underpinning that kind of goes through all our judicial systems and everything else. So we kind of get it a little bit, but it's really difficult to like really get that without some of those religious backgrounds, I think. I think that really wires it in on like a metaphysical level, not just a societal or civil level. And there's something when you wire something in at that part of your brain, almost like a spiritual tone to something, it impacts you deeper than if it's just like a socially constructed thing.
Can you imagine how emotionally and psychologically sick you would feel if you couldn't forgive the person who had wronged you and continues to wrong you? Like if you couldn't...
You're not talking in the abstract. You're talking about
No, I'm talking about from you. Like, because of course I'm aware of who you're and who and what the situation is.
Yeah.
Can you imagine just how much poison would be inside you if you just let all of that stack and you couldn't forgive it?
And they're harming people that I love too. And it's so hard to be in a situation with that. So I have to find the mercy and the grace and the forgiveness because I can't change the situation. Mm-hmm. So all it would do is it would just poison me. Mm-hmm. I would become a poisoned person of unforgiveness with no mercy, and I'm not extending mercy or forgiveness or grace to myself either.
Yeah.
Right? When I have a screw up or something, I'm like, oh man, I should then I'm going to be harsh on myself. Like it's this whole way of being and thinking around this kind of stuff.
Well, it's merciful on yourself to forgive them.
Yeah.
Because it's like that. What is that old saying? I'm probably going to butcher it, but it's resentment is like taking poison and hoping the other person dies from it. Right? Like it's just a poison inside of you. It doesn't do anything to them. They don't care.
Yeah. By the way, I'm so eager to get this on this type stuff.
Okay.
So
okay. Well, I
think it'll be an interesting conversation to freeform. I don't know if I'm right on some of my instincts here, but I'd love to talk it out and co-create it with you and see if we can develop some understanding around some things, some ideas I've got.
All right, so I have two more. I have two more things I want to mention.
Let's go.
The first one is that, just to piggyback off the concept of forgiveness, I remember the scripture. I think it's part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is talking about when you lay your gift at the altar and you remember somebody has something against you, put your gift, lay your gift next to the altar, go make peace, and then come back and sacrifice it. Right. So basically, interrupt your worship to go make peace. And I always misread that scripture to say, if you remember you have something against your brother, but it actually is written, you remember somebody else has something against you. So the concept of proactively creating peace, right? And in a religious or in a context like that, the very idea that you would interrupt your worship to God, right? Because that's what setting your sacrifice aside, go and making peace, and then coming back and then completing the sacrifice, that is disrupting worship. So this idea that it's so important to God that you would disrupt your worship to go make peace and then come back and complete your worship indicates that it was very important. And I remember really integrating that. And I remember becoming good at making peace with somebody who, like, people who were mad at me. Like, if I knew somebody was mad at me, I got really good at reaching out to them and giving them an opportunity to talk, and then building bridges and then creating peace. Now, I don't think that that's always the thing that one has to do. I mean, there's going to be plenty of people like in a situation like we're in, people are going to be mad at me just for having said something on the podcast. I don't really have a relationship with them. I don't really know who they are. So of course that wouldn't apply in those kinds of situations. But if somebody is in your life, if you have a relationship with them, even if they're sort of an ancillary person in your life, the ability to make peace in those contexts has been a very powerful tool. And I think it gave me a lot of gifts.
So there were two things. What's the other one?
So the fruitage of the Spirit.
Okay.
So Galatians, I've lost.
So 13?
No, 5.
Yeah.
22 and 23, I think.
I'm thinking about the love chapter. Corinthians for 13.
I've
lost my references too.
I know, it's like it's leaving me, but I'm pretty sure it's Galatians 5:22, where Paul is talking about the fruitage of the Spirit. The Apostle Paul is talking about the fruitage of the Spirit. So fruitage means emergent. Right? Fruit is the emergent property of something that has been sown. So I think of it as a system running, and the emergent property is this list of things that he calls the fruitage of the Spirit, meaning that if you have God's Spirit, people will know because these things will be evident in your life. This will be the emergent property of that system running, where God's Spirit is a node in your system. And the list of things is, and those of you who are Christian probably have this memorized as well. It's love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faith, mildness, and self-control. And if you used a different translation than I did growing up, some of those words might be slightly different. But love, joy, peace are all things that every human being wants. And so when I know that I'm in a good space, regardless of whether or not it's quote-unquote God's Spirit, or whether or not it's just the spirit of, like, the positive spirit force of the universe, or whatever you want to call it, love, joy, and peace have become sort of my, and the rest of them too, have become my awareness that I am evidencing some of the best fruit, right? The best emergence that a person can. Love, joy, peace. Long-suffering, meaning that I can get through really bad situations. When I'm in a really horrible situation, I lean back and I go, you know what? I don't have to suffer needlessly, but I have to be able to suffer when I'm in a situation I can do nothing about it. Because those moments are just going to come up in life. My translation was patience. I think long-suffering is maybe a better term. Patience is a fantastic word. Love, joy, peace. I forgot peace. Obviously, peace is a good one. Patience or long-suffering. Love, joy, peace. Long-suffering. Kindness. I did a whole thing about how kindness is different than niceness, and that was a game changer for me. Nice is about how people see you, their impressions of you, but kindness is about doing what's in somebody else's best interest, even if they end up having a bad image of you. So it's not about your reputation. Nice is about your reputation. Kindness is about really doing things in other people's behalf. It has been a guiding star for me for a long time. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness. Goodness means goodwill, right? Generosity is oftentimes how I think of myself, as being in a good space. I am generous with my energy, with my thoughts, with my resources. I should have written this down because I have my translation. I jotted it down as you were talking, so you can maybe translate it. I keep having to go through all of them to remember. So I'll just give you my list. Mine was, in my translation, was love, joy, peace, goodness, kindness,
patience, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That's how I came to learn that list, basically.
Yeah, I'm going to have to write this down because I keep having to go through the whole thing every time I say it.
No worries. So I'll just repeat mine again. Love, joy, peace, goodness, kindness, patience, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I think...
I don't remember now. You keep talking, so I can't write it down. Anyway, yeah.
Well, just say it out loud. Say it out loud.
I've said it out loud 4 times. Every time I say it out loud, I just going through. I'll just say this every time I go through the list. I'm like, yep, that's applicable. Yep, that's applicable. Yep, that's something that when I have that feels good. The self-control piece, giving gifts to my future self. The mildness piece. It's like having a mild temper when things make me want to flare up. It's like all of these things help me know that I'm on the right track. And it's probably, even though I don't reference scripture in my brain anymore like I used to, it is probably the one scripture that I think about the most often. And they're all gifts. Like all of those things have become gifts for me to know that I'm on the right path.
I think this idea of love and the concepts of love, I think the reason why when you said the fruit of the Spirit, the passages of Scripture from, I think it's 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that come up for me, where it talks about, it's the chapter of love. It talks about what love is and how love is expressed. It keeps no record of wrongs. It doesn't look for faults. It's like all these characteristics of love and how it shows up in the world. I also don't necessarily reference Scripture, but it's such a part of the wiring of my mind that some of these things that I used to meditate on and saturate my mind with, I can't help but have them still percolate and pop up for me. Like they come up to the surface for me. And it's really impactful for my life. Like I'm going through life and I'm thinking about maybe something I've got trouble with. And then all of a sudden the passages would come flooding in about what love is. It's not keeping, like you and I are in a relationship situation. And that keep no record of wrongs sticks in my head. It's like, well, but you did, man, I shouldn't keep, like love isn't going to keep a record of this. Like this isn't transactional. Like we're not going to do a tit for tat here. Like, I love you, I don't care, and I let it go. And that's something I'm super grateful for from my religious upbringing as well, is the ability to look at those things and go, that's not really what love's about. And that's been really powerful for me.
Yeah. The translation I grew up with said that if you didn't have love, you become a sounding piece of brass and a clashing cymbal. And I always think of like little kids like banging drums walking through a room. Just like just the most raucous, horrible noise. And I'm like, yeah, if I don't have love in this moment and I'm arguing, I probably sound like a sounding piece of brass and a clashing cymbal.
Yeah. I also like the idea of those emergence, fruits of the Spirit being emergence. Fruit is an emergent, but it's also the seed of the next emergent, right? The fruit off of a tree grows another tree. And so when you see these characteristics showing up in your life, we sound like we're doing a religious podcast now.
I think we could
get right with God. Yeah, we could start a cult real easily. If you see these things showing up in your life, these are things that are going to be seeds of something that's also good and beneficial for the world. When you have love, it's an emergent of kind of doing things. Love, joy, peace, goodness, kindness, patience, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. These are emergents, and also they're seeds of starting more emergents that are even better going forward. So I think I love that you said those are emergents. That really stuck with me. That's a really powerful framework, but it's a seed emergent, which is cool because it can launch into something else. I'm so eager to talk about type stuff.
Okay, is this sermon over?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm good. I said all the things that I like that were floating around my head about the things that I'm very grateful that I integrated throughout my life. So I didn't keep everything, but those were some of the ones I kept. I'm very happy that they were taught to me.
So from a typology standpoint, I noticed a difference here in your and my list that we came to. You talked about, now I threw self-sacrifice in when you were talking about humility, modesty, and proactive peace, and I threw in self-sacrifice. And all of those things are designed to create and maintain collective transaction and connection with the collective group, which is a very extroverted feeling, introverted thinking perspective. So harmony, accuracy, sees things in terms of modesty, like introverted thinking would see things in terms of, I don't care who has the idea. If it's a good idea, it's a good idea, right? That's kind of the introverted thinking. And this idea of humility and proactive peace is a very extroverted feeling idea of go and proactively reestablish the connection before you can be right with God. It's about your fellow man and woman and connecting with your human, companions in the world to keep that connection going. So it's a very extroverted feeling, introverted thinking. And the things I talked about, which were forgiveness and grace and mercy and debt payments, was very introverted feeling, extroverted thinking perspective about, what the debt is, where we stand, extending mercy. It's like judicial type language, like justice and mercy and all these different things. And so it's interesting to see how when we start talking about the benefits we got from our religious paradigms, we tend to hyper-focus on what resonated with our personalities, right?
Yeah.
And I bet you're listening along, resonating with some things that also resonate with your personality.
Yeah, you didn't mention it a lot on this particular podcast, but I know that concept of self-discipline and self-control is a big one for you too.
Absolutely, which is a very introverted feeling, extroverted thinking concept. I mean, not that, again, all of these things, like I like connection with people. That's not the point. The point is where we're coming at it
and
from.
I like self-control and self-discipline as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But these are interesting. And so yours is more collective, transactional, and connective, and mine's more individual. Debt load, the mercy extended to the individual who might have harmed someone, forgiveness. All of these things are a very introverted feeling, extroverted thinking concept. And so I think that's interesting how we cluster. And I bet you a lot of our conversations in the world, without the religious paradigm there, our differences probably come down to some of these things as well, right? We come down to where at one time, I think the emphasis was actually on the FITE polarity side. I think the emphasis was more on introverted feeling, extroverted thinking, saying, what's the debt we owe to God? What's the debt we owe? What's the forgiveness structure? What's all the judicial things to equalize us and God and all this? And in our modern world, I think we're more morphing over to the extroverted feeling, introverted thinking side of it. Like it's not like that's not focused on the debt forgiveness. Like who cares if we're forgiving somebody? We got to get the connection piece down. So it's really interesting how these things play out, and probably different subcultures, religious subcultures, depending on the type of church or mosque or synagogue or whatever, faith background you might come from. It probably leans more toward one of these kind of groupings over the other. I think even political systems do that. Like entire political systems group around these as well.
Oh, definitely.
So it's very interesting to see type play into this and the cognitive functions play into this.
Well, and we did that podcast a long time ago on religion and personality type, and indicated that if your religion is feeding all of your cognitive functions, you're probably going to stick around because you're getting nourished. And if it's going against your cognitive function stack or the functions in your car, then you're probably going to leave because you're feeling malnourished in those contexts. But when I left because the holistic religion was not suiting my functions, I still kept with me the things that had. Like I took with me all of the stuff that was actually good for my functions to learn. And then what's nice is that I get to keep those, and I get to keep, I mean, there's nothing that tells me that I can't continue to implement these principles. Like, again, just because I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Like, just because it wasn't holistically right for me doesn't mean that there weren't elements of it that were powerful and helped make me who I am today. And the gratitude I experience, which is true, it's like real, authentic gratitude. It's not BS just for a podcast. This isn't just like, hey, let's talk nicey nice about religion for whatever reason. Like, I honestly go through my life on a daily basis, very, very grateful that I was raised in the context I was in. Even though I sometimes call it a cult, and even though, I call it a cult every day probably, and even though I feel like it's not...
but everything's a cult, so that doesn't...
Yeah.
It's not specific. I mean, literally every belief structure is a cult, so...
I've come to that conclusion, personally.
That's how it is.
I belong to other cults. All right, I've chosen different cults that are more suited towards me. But that said, despite the fact that I don't think very fondly of certain aspects of it, there are things that I wouldn't give up. And I mean, just like all of us, who would we be if we didn't have the experiences of our past? We almost can't, we don't know who we'd be. And I'm grateful for who I've become. And I'm grateful that the experiences of my past have allowed me to become who I am.
And gratitude itself is something I think we got from our religious upbringing. The ability to take something maybe that wasn't ideal and still find the gratitude in that also, I think, points back to how our brains were wired from our religious upbringing. To say, and I think gratitude is an alchemy. It's an alchemization of the anger or the resentment or the sadness or the despondency or the low vibration energies that would come into our world. Gratitude gets rid of all that. It starts to focus on what we have rather than what we don't have, what we benefit from rather than what we don't benefit from. It puts us into the category of looking toward light and goodness and openness and what we can be just truly grateful to have in our lives. It's such a powerful tool for this. So I think probably our message to you listening is or our question to you, or at least our thought towards you would be, where can you find the gratitude in maybe something you've transcended, a paradigm? Maybe it wasn't a religious paradigm. Maybe it was a political or social or cultural or family, paradigm, something you were raised with that was so real to you. It was like fish swimming in water. It was the water you lived in, the reality you lived in. And now you're outside of it, and maybe there's some resentment and anger and frustration and hurt and bitterness and sadness and brokenness around it. What can you do to start to see some of the grateful things that come from the experiences you've had, and be able to hook some of those experiences into that gratitude and say, you know what, this is something good I got from that. Nothing's all good or all bad. I think it's something my introverted feeling tells me, right? Everything's got good and bad elements. And what are the things I can be grateful for here? It can be a powerful exercise in healing, in feeling more empowered, and not feeling like you're the victim, and feeling like you've got a sense of yourself, a sense of the world, and a sense of a way to move forward. It doesn't mean you don't have to go through time periods of grief or struggle, or, you should be able to own, it's my perspective, you should be able to own the bad feelings that might come up from stuff. And at some point, you're going to transcend that. You can't stay there. I mean, I guess you could stay there forever. I don't believe, personally, my experience has been it's not healthy for me to stay there forever and just churn in bitterness or frustration or sadness or hurt or anger. It's find ways to move forward. And this is, I think, a pathway to move forward if you so choose. So what are your thoughts? What do you think about this idea? We'd love to hear from you. You can come over to personalityhacker.com, leave a comment, ask a question, or share your story directly below this podcast. We'd love to hear from you. The community would love to hear from you. In fact, speaking of community, we'd love to see you a part of the Personality Hacker ecosystem. We're all over the different social media channels, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Come and subscribe and follow and like and be a part of the ongoing discussions between these podcasts. I think it's really important for us to be connected as a community together.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. You can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That is still incredibly helpful. If you've read our book, if you haven't read our book, go get it. And if you have, you can leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads. I like reading both of those. I read every single review that comes through. I do. I can't help it.
At the time of this recording, Spotify just went public with an IPO, and I think they're going to be the real deal, a big player. And I know we're distributed on Spotify, so if you're a Spotify user, you can find us there and subscribe as well. You don't have to go to iTunes or an Android platform. You can go directly to Spotify. I believe our feed is there as well. We'd love to have you subscribe on Spotify because I know a lot of people use that platform now.
There you go. Yeah, so all sorts of great ways to access the podcast and leave us rating and reviews, and we're super duper grateful for all of it.
Yeah. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.